Assalamualaikum and good greetings. So today I'll be watching a video titled How to Study Smarter, Not Harder. Basically the theme of this university, at least now, is that we are going into the examination period. It will start in few days and the students are focusing on their study most of the time. Hopefully they are not study the things for the first time. It should be a revision where they revisit and revise what they already have studied earlier, right? But if there is something that they study for the first time, at least, well, people say better late than never, right? Anyway, I'm not sure what will be the tips or something that will be shared by this video, but without further ado, let's watch.
Have you ever read a page in a book but then had to go back and read it again because you realised you didn't actually take any of it in? Then this video is for you, because I talk about study smarter, not harder quite often on this channel. In fact, the most viewed video on this channel with 4.6 million views is a video titled Study Hard and Study Smart. And people ask me all the time, how do you study smart? Well, reading a page in a book or chapter in a book and then not retaining any of the information is a waste of time and a great example of not studying smart. There are a lot of reading hacks or studying hacks online on how you can study smarter and remember everything you read or remember everything you study, but at least in my experience, most of them are not that effective. So in this video, I'm going to go through the most powerful, most effective study methods and techniques that I have used and that helped me through university, and that can also implement yourself so that you can study more efficiently and achieve better grades without actually increasing your studying time.
Okay, I'm not sure what is his background in the sense that what is the course or majoring that he takes, because reading books through the pages, etc., for different type of knowledge requires different approach, maybe, right? So because I'm teaching engineering, and if you go through the textbook of engineering, of course you have the theoretical part and you have the calculation part and so on. So I'm not sure, but still there will be a theoretical part, right? So at least if you understand what's going on there, then it helps in terms of the application, right? So let's see.
Advanced information processing. This is a memorization technique that I picked up from Jim Kwik, who is a reading and memory improvement expert, and it's such a simple idea, but it's incredible how powerful it is and how much time it saves. You can study for 2 hours and retain the same amount of information as someone else who studies for 8 hours. It really is that powerful. So the key to memorizing what you read is asking more questions. If you read a book and you get to the end, but you think back and realize that you don't remember anything you read, it's because you're not asking questions. And this is a huge problem when reading big, thick textbooks that, let's be honest, are not the most interesting and engaging books to read. But by simply asking yourself questions when reading, it can exponentially increase the amount of information you retain from that book. I never just picked up a textbook and started reading it without regularly asking questions throughout, because if you're just passively reading rather than actively reading, you're wasting your time and you're not studying smart. You need to engage your mindset where you're more receptive to the information you're reading.
That is very true, I guess. It is interesting that he actually shares something that is being shared by someone that I have seen a lot of the advertisement, but I haven't never actually learned from him directly. But that makes sense. I think the same book that I have read early on, maybe my passion towards reading books nowadays is more towards Islamic understanding, conceptual movement, operation. In our language, maybe we say Da'wah and Tarbiyah books, something like that. And before, when it is being forced on me to read it, and now I'm looking for answer, I think the experience and how that is being retained and actually impact me in my daily life is very, very different. I think the same can be said when I read the Quran, right? Because when you actively want to understand what should I do based on what is being revealed, it is different than you just passively read. Of course, most of Muslims actually read the Arabic without even understanding. That's even worse. But anyway, going on.
When I was reading a thick, heavy textbook, I would make notes on a separate piece of paper, and I'd put a line down the middle of the page, and on the left side I would make notes, and these would just be the most important snippets of the text that I thought might be useful for the exam. On the right side, I'd have my own thoughts and questions on what I just read. And Jim Kwik talks about this method of retaining information from books quite often. He says that there are 3 main questions you should be writing down on the right side of the page. The first question is, how can I use this? And so it forces you to link pieces of information from the book to the bigger picture. How does the information that you just read link in with the knowledge that you already know? And what happens at this stage is that your brain is linking these new pieces of information to things that you already know and strengthening your neural network, therefore making it easier to remember in the future. The second question is, when will I use this? What this question does is that it adds urgency. When is your exam coming? Is it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or in 2 months maybe? Often when you're reading a textbook, you're just skimming through it passively because you're not engaged in the reading. There's no urgency there. And the reason why so many students are cramming 24 hours before the exam is because there's a sense of urgency. You know you need to get that material memorized before the exam the next day.
So the urgency part, yeah, that's, I think most of us can relate to, you know, at the crunch time, and you really have to finish what you do in very limited time, and then, you know, but how to replicate it, because then it's just whatever you can manage within that time period, right? But how to replicate that process throughout so that you learn much more, that is the question, I think.
So that's why you're far more engaged. And by asking the question, when will I use this, you're adding artificial urgency to your studying, because you do have a deadline, usually your exam date, but it's all too easy to forget this when you have weeks or even months to study before the exam. And the third question is, why must I use this?
Okay, still when he say about when, it's still exam focused, right? So because I'm of course this video I think is relating to perform in your exam, but for me nowadays, reading, of course there's still academic obligation. If I want to write article paper, I have to do literature, etc., and then it does involve reading, right? But most of the time, most of my reading now is to find things to improve what I'm doing in a real life, right? In Islamic works, in da'wah, in tarbiyah, whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Because if it's not a must, then there's nothing compelling you to do it. So it could be because the notes that you just wrote down could be the answer to a certain question in the exam, for example. If your lecturer has asked you to read a certain chapter in a textbook, there's usually a good reason why they've recommended it. And that reason could be because the content in that chapter is likely to come up in the exam. The second study method you should be using to study smarter is spaced repetition.
Okay, before we go to the second one, why? That's a big question, right? But because otherwise I don't think if we have even a required amount of interest to even understand what's going on. And how is this fit in? I think is it how is the first question to ask, is it how or what? Let me, I cannot see, where is it?
First question is, how can I use this?
How can I use it, right? Not how, yeah. So I think that is quite interesting, because when I teach engineering courses so far, it is being, you know, the elements being separated so that we can learn one bit by one bit. But I think many students cannot even link between why even this being learned, because eventually when the question comes, actually it is combination of all those concepts, and you have to understand how each and every part link together to solve a bigger problem. Maybe it's my failing to, you know, give the picture of the puzzle to the student. Maybe I have to improve that so that the student can appreciate each part of the puzzle more.
you should be using to study smarter is spaced repetition. And spaced repetition is where you memorize some information and then a period of time later, maybe a couple of days or 1 week later, you come back to it and you reread it to reinforce it in your memory. And this was the single most effective memorization technique I used at university. It saved me so much time because I didn't have to spend hours trying to memorize each individual piece of information. Instead, I would just memorize it for a few minutes until I just kind of remembered it. And then a few days later, or sometimes just a few hours later, sometimes a few days later, I'd come back to it and reread it. And a few days after that, I'd do the same. And it saves so much time. And honestly, it's a really stress-free way of memorizing information because you're not spending hours getting stressed out over why you're not able to memorize and retain your study material. Spaced repetition takes advantage of what is called the spacing effect, which was a phenomenon first identified by Hermann Ebbinghaus way back in 1885 in his book Memory, A Contribution to Experimental Psychology, which suggests that active recall with increasing time intervals helps the brain process and retain information. So when trying to memorize some of your study material, you might read the material, then come back to it 6 hours later, and then again 24 hours later, and then after that you might come back to it in 3 days. And as soon as you start to solidify the information into your memory, the periods in between the time you read it will increase to 7 days, even 14 days and upwards. And every time you come back to review the information, you'll realize that you'll start to remember the material better each time, to the point where if you had a question in the exam, you'd be able to remember everything perfectly. One caveat to using this memorization technique is that you need to be organized and start preparing for your exams well in advance.
I was thinking that, right, because that method, although most of us have heard it before, it does take discipline so that you have that kind of how to schedule when to revisit what. Because in the class we have several courses per day for every chapter, for example, or half a chapter, and then tomorrow we have another thing, and so on. And how to, arrange, okay, just look back at yesterday's and 2 days after, etc. You have to be somewhat or kind of organized, which is one of my biggest problem. Now, I one thing that I appreciate about this, without meaning that even without organizing myself, but it happened, not to say accidentally, but because of other things, surrounding things, is that, for example, currently I'm handling multiple halaqah. For those who don't know that, I'm sorry, but if you know that, I think you know what I'm talking about, right? So I'm handling different groups. So every week I have like 4 or 5 groups that I'm sharing something similar with, and then it coincidentally become a repetition, and hence I realized after a while that those things, even without revising it back, it kind of already stuck, because you without knowing, because you prepare for each and every day's halaqah, it reinforce. Similarly, when I keep on giving talk or daurah about certain topics, and normally because the target group is different, I repeat the same topic, etc., and it does reinforce that, and it becomes something that you tend to not forget after that, compared to before, when I'm the one going through the process and listening to daurah, listening to speeches, etc. It is very hard to retain all those information, but because I'm actively finding opportunity to deliver all those topics, it helps me a lot. And I always say this, that's part of the reason why I'm addicted to sharing this kind of topics, because I'm the primary beneficiary here.
Obviously, if you're cramming in your revision for your exam tomorrow, this isn't going to work as well. However, the next study method utilizing the Pareto principle just might help you. The Pareto principle. The Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, suggests that 80% of outcomes results in 20% of the causes. So for example, it's very likely that 80% of the grades that you achieve come from 20% of your studying. So you need to prioritize this 20%. But what exactly does this mean? When you're studying, there are some tasks that you'll be doing that are not that important. They won't directly help you with your final exams. And this is the 80% of your study. And these tasks might include background reading from your textbooks or completing homework assignments from the lecturer. Then there are tasks that do directly affect your grade. And this is the 20% of your studying that you need to prioritize. This involves answering past paper questions and consolidating and summarizing lecture notes in preparation for your exam. Your brain can only retain a certain amount of information before, over time, it starts to forget. And late 19th century German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus dubbed this the forgetting curve. So if you're trying to make your studying as efficient as you can and study as smart as possible, it's important that you spend more time focusing on the study areas that will directly affect your exam paper. And this often means you don't need to read whole textbooks, but rather just focus on areas that you think or that you know will be in the exam.
So this one is very exam oriented, and of course many students do need something that is very exam oriented. I think I've come across many students that excel in the secondary or high school exam, SPM, etc. That excel due to this, right? Because the teacher know what exactly is the type of question that will come up in the exam, and they drill the student, on that specifically so that they can excel. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the student actually become fully equipped with university, because when they are on their own, having to study on their own. Of course, this may still apply if the lecturer keep repeating the same type of question in the exam, etc. When my undergraduate study back then, also there are lecturers that keep on recycling questions, and we just find all from the seniors, all the past papers, and we can excel. But if you have some lecturer, like some of myself, my colleague, that tend to find questions that never have been asked before, something like that, then you really have to know, the basics to be able to solve whatever type of question that will come up.
Feynman technique. When you're studying for an exam, it's important that you put effort into truly understanding the information. It's extremely difficult to memorize and recall something if you don't understand what it is or what it means. And if you forget some part of it, you'll not be able to continue because you've only memorized the order of the words, not the actual meaning. So what you should do is read the entire piece of information and rewrite it or reword it in your own words. The Feynman technique is a good way of testing yourself to see whether you truly do understand something.
This is a great thing that he's mentioning, that I do expect from final year engineering student, when they write literature review, this is what they did, that they use their own words to describe what they're understanding from reviewing available literature. But it almost never happen. It's almost always cut and paste in a way that clearly show that they do not fully understand what they are cutting and pasting. Sadly.
The Feynman technique involves teaching the content that you have just learned to others, and it involves 4 basic steps. Step 1, study. This is as simple as it gets, just sit down and study a topic. Step 2, and here's the interesting part, teach what you just learned when you were studying to someone with zero knowledge of the subject, but make sure that your books and notebooks are closed. You should teach someone who hasn't even read the basics of the field you're studying. Simplify the concepts to the greatest extent possible. Use pen and paper or a whiteboard to draw diagrams if necessary, just like a teacher would. So for a high school student, imagine explaining it to a 6th schooler for a university student. You just have to assume that the person has no knowledge of the topic. Step 3. Observe which parts of the topic you were able to explain well and which parts you couldn't explain well. And now go back to the book and try to understand the topics once again. If while you were explaining the topic you noticed that you used a lot of academic jargon, bear in mind that it may be because you didn't understand the topic well enough. You should be able to explain complex topics in very basic terminology. Step 4. Repeat the above mentioned steps until you can explain the topic without any gaps or use of jargon in your explanation without opening your book. Several studies have shown that students have better memory and recall abilities when they have the expectation that they will have to teach it to someone else. And it makes sense because a teacher not only has to learn the information for themselves, but they also have to know the material well enough that they can explain it in a very simple terms.
This is very important for those who, you know, are in the process of I'm relating much to my Islamic journey, right? Even though this is about academic, right? Because there's a great parallel here, because this concept is universally applicable. If you really want your trajectory of understanding something, you know, to go off the chart, through the roof or whatever, do apply this, meaning that how to say, the most beneficial thing that I have done over the years is basically, you know, if I have the opportunity, I will, you know, conduct halaqah, usrah, you know, study groups, because I'm the one that gain the most compared to the listener. You are the one that benefit the most from the process, right? So if you just want to become the receiver, let the murabbi, the nakib, the teacher, the senior, the mentor sharing with me, normally you retain very limited. But if you are there, you will see that your growth will go up, right? So do take that role of, even in academic, mentor your friends, as a share, and whatever you understand, straight away share with your friends. And if okay, you know, I'm stuck here in trying to explain, you go back, and then you know, you will realize that, you know, your trajectory of growth will go up much more significantly.
They also have to be ready for any question that might be thrown at them. As Richard Feynman once said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So now you know how to study smart. You can process and retain as much information in 2 hours that many other students would take 8 hours to learn. And now imagine if you can study smart and study hard. Imagine if you can study so incredibly efficiently, but still be able to study for 14 hours a day. I made a video recently on how you can study hard, how you can study for 14 hours a day. You can click on the video on the screen, because if you can combine those two things, to be able to study smart and study hard at the same time, your grades are almost guaranteed to increase significantly. It's almost impossible for them not to. So,
alright, so that's the end of this video. Very beneficial, I would say. Although if you are, you know, my student or any other student that is already facing the exam, hopefully this, because many of this it's still applicable, you still have time to apply some of this, but it is very beneficial if you apply it from the beginning of the semester. For those who want to grow as a Muslim, as a da'i, etc., really apply this as well in that aspect. You know, you are the one who will gain from it. Alright, thank you for watching. Hopefully this has been beneficial, and see you next time.